Lucy, thank you for bringing me to this house, Jane Austen's house. First of all, Jane Austen, one of the world's greatest novelists?
Oh, totally. And a really, not only an important writer, but an important human being.
Important human?
Yeah, I think so. One of my favourite people from history.
That's interesting. She's one of my favourite authors, but I hate Emma. Is that normal?
Oh, yeah. So many people hate
I hate Emma.
Except for the people who really, really love her.
And then do they dislike the other ones? Is that a thing in Jane Austen studies? Like, if you love Persuasion and Pride and Prejudice and hate Emma, or is it the other way around? Do you love Emma and hate the other ones?
I think that a true Austen lover's gonna love them all. But you probably hate Emma because she's a bit kind of full of herself, uppity, know-it-all. And some people are drawn to a character like that, inexplicably.
Lucy, I love know-it-alls. You know better than anybody that I love know-it-alls. But no, I don't like Emma because it's weird. At the end, she kind of marries her father figure. That's why I don't like that novel. Sorry, spoiler alert.
Yeah, that's one way of looking at it, but he is kind and good and so much more emotionally mature than, say, Mr Darcy.
Okay, well, we can get into this. Now listen, tell me, what is the importance of this house and what am I going to see?
This is the house where it's generally accepted that Jane Austen was happy and productive and finally sort of settled in life after quite an itinerant journey through life. And here she wrote her 3 late great novels. And here, and this is where it all turns tragic and heartbreaking, here she got ill with the strange illness that killed her when she was only 41 years old, pretty young.
And when she died, was she a figure of national celebration? Is that why the house was preserved, or was it rescued later?
She was so not a figure of national celebration. During her lifetime, 4 of her main 6 books were published, but her name wasn't on them because that was not genteel, that was not ladylike. And the point about this house is that although it looks like a highly desirable residence, and I'd be very glad to live here myself, for her, at her level in society, this was a bit of a come down. This was slightly slumming it for somebody like her, whose brother was immensely rich and he lived in a mansion up the road and he had another mansion in Kent and he was fantastically wealthy. So this was a funny little place where she found a funny little way of living, I would say.
Can we go inside and look at that funny way of living?
Let's have a look.
So this would have been a sort of a cottage or a little house at the time?
It was a bailiff's cottage for the rich brother. And then he could see that his widowed mother and sisters were in a hole because they were all single ladies with no money and nowhere to live. So finally, and it took him a long time, he said, you can come and live in this cottage that I've got. And at that time, they were living in a house in Southampton where they couldn't really afford the rent and the roof leaked, and he got them out of a hole. But on the other hand...
So he should have done.
So he should have done. And also, they belonged to this level of society that was called the pseudo gentry. I quite like this term. It means that you want to be in the landed gentry, but you haven't actually got any land, but you have aspirations. So there's a certain amount of make, do and mend and keeping up appearances. And so this little cottage was by the village pond, now missing. It was damp. There was a lot of traffic going past. The stagecoach used to almost make the building shake. And the building here, it used to get quite full up because all of the nieces and nephews that Jane Austen had, she had 33 nieces and nephews, used to come and stay uninvited. So in some ways, you know, it was a good solution and she was able to get on with her writing here. But in other ways, it was second best for somebody who was born into her level of society.
Was the pseudo-gentry a very scary place to be? If you drop out of that, what happens to you? I mean...
It's really... She could not, her family did not sort of really give her the confidence to go out and, for example, get a job. She could have become a governess. She could have earned £35 a year doing that. The total expectation for her in life was that she'd get married to a rich man.
And so her brother was quite grudgingly supporting them.
Yes.
And was she, even by the end of her life, was the money coming in from book sales and everything, was it able to support this lifestyle at all? Or was she depend on her brother her whole life?
She sort of was, really. By the time she died at 41, her lifetime earnings from all of her novels that she published so far were £650. Now, that's quite a lot if you compare it to the salary of a governess at £35 a year. But if you were, say, a Georgian solicitor or doctor, you'd earn that much in 6 months. It wasn't a whole lot of money. So here she is occupying this sort of funny, precarious, upper to middle to lower to middle level in society.
And let's talk about the room that we're in now. What do we know? Would this have been how it was when she was in the house?
Yes, pretty. This is the drawing room, and the ladies. So Mrs. Austen and Jane and her sister, when they moved in, they added this window into it, and they closed up, I think I'm right in saying, a window that looked onto the road, because they were trying to convert it from being a cottage on a busy road that had previously been a pub, actually, and they're trying to make it more into a little country house with a view of the garden.
Yes,
Do you see?
Much more
There's a
bucolic out there.
bit of gentrification going on. The story goes that the books were written in this room here, and this is the creation myth of Jane Austen's late great three books that she wrote here. She's supposed to have sat at that little wobbly table, and this room had a squeaky door, and the story goes that she would never get the squeak at the door fixed because that was her warning that somebody was going to come in, and that meant that she would put away the paper. She wasn't supposed to be writing these books, don't forget. And then she would get on with winding wool or playing shuttlecock or whatever it was that the 33 nieces and nephews wanted her to do. So here, sort of in secret.
But that can't be true.
Oh, well, there's no actual hardcore evidence for it. But it does make psychological sense that what ladies were supposed to do if they failed to marry a rich man, which she did incidentally have the chance of doing, she just broke off her engagement and decided to become a professional writer instead. What they were supposed to spend their time doing was writing letters to their relatives. So that was fine. It was okay for her to sit at a little table with a little square of paper and to be apparently writing something, but ladies weren't supposed to write novels. The later history of this house is that after Jane's sister Cassandra eventually died, and she lived over a long time without Jane, the house sort of sunk back down again, and it was split up and it was made into cottages for farm labourers. Then later on in the 20th century, when this cult of Jane Austen started to develop, people started to look around the village for artefacts that had come from the house. And I think one of the old gardeners of the village had this in his house, and he said, well, you know, this is the table.
This is the table.
This is the table. So it now is a sort of sacred relic.
Fine, exactly. Look, it's got a special protectant.
It has. It's such an important thing. It's really... it's fantastic. And what I like about it is that it's so small and insignificant looking and kind of rubbish looking. But that's the secret of her brilliance for me, that out of very ordinary things and a life that wasn't particularly glamorous, these amazing works of art were produced.
So, this is the things that English professors have argued about for hundreds of years. How much of Jane Austen's personal experience was she transmitting into those manuscripts that she was writing?
Well, on one level, nothing, because she was a brilliant artist. She took real life, she did something magical to it, and she turned it into fiction. But on another level, everything, because I believe that the underlying message of all of her books, all of them, is look how rubbish it is that women in Georgian society, women like Jane Austen herself, are put into this position where they believe they have to marry for money, that there is no other option to them. And if you look at Anne Elliot, the character of Persuasion, for example, she's 28 years old. She's on the shelf. She's entering what are called the years of danger. Her life is going to be a failure unless she gets married. And she does get married. But with Jane Austen, there's always this twist. There's always something very slightly unsatisfactory about the marriages that so neatly wrap up the ends of the books. I think that you can read them, and this is what's brilliant about Jane Austen. You can read them on so many levels. You can read them as happy, jolly, funny love stories, or you can read them as a really sharp critique of Georgian society.
And so you did say there were a few jobs open to women, but why wouldn't her brother have been more generous? Was it just assumed that the women would be taken off his hands?
I think that the girls were definitely brought up to get married. So her father was a teacher. He taught boys Latin, Greek. He didn't teach Latin and Greek to his daughters, even though he was a very good teacher, because that would have made them less marriageable. That was definitely their purpose in life. And I guess the family always assumed that one day it would happen. And then when it didn't happen, they became became sort of a bit like parcels. And the different brothers would hand the girls from house to house. Look, you have them for a bit. And then they say, no, well, they can go and stay with their friend for a while. And there's this sort of sense that they were...
Inconvenient.
Yes, inconvenient.
Lucy, where should we go next?
Let's go and see one of the most intimate bits of the house, her little bedroom. So this little room is not enormous, and there was even less space because there were two of these beds, one for Jane and one for her sister Cassandra, and they had such a close relationship. People said it was as if they were married to each other because both of them were spinsters, and they, because Jane's mother had a lot of children, there's a sense that Cassandra, Jane's older sister, stood in as a mother to her, and they had this very close relationship. And one of the reasons we know a lot about Jane's life is because of the letters that they used to exchange when they weren't in the same house. And one of the things that Cassandra did later, she gets a lot of stick for, is destroy a lot of Jane Austen's letters. And I think that is because they were full of such offensive jokes about their family and friends.
And was Cassandra a wonderful writer and correspondent as well, or did Jane just have this extraordinary talent?
Well, I don't think Cassandra had the gift, but some of the most moving things you'll ever read, really, are accounts that Cassandra wrote of her sister's last days. And the reason we're talking about Jane Austen today is not because she needs the attention. She's a global brand. People have heard of her all over the world. But there's still a sense, I feel, of injustice about her life, which is that she was cut off in her prime, and before she got the attention, the money that she deserved as well. I guess a sense of unfinished business.
Did she die in this room?
No, she didn't, but they were living here in their two little beds when she began to get strangely ill. And this was unfolding in 1816 and into 1817. So we are now in April 1818. And so it was 201 years ago next month that the two of them left this house and they went to rent rooms in the town centre of Winchester to be near to the hospital and to the doctors there. And that's where she lived out the very last weeks of her life.
What did she die of? Do we now know?
Well, it's a mystery. It's so many different theories are put forward. One of the theories is that she had an impaired immune system because she was born a month late, and there are 5% of babies who spend longer than 43 weeks in the womb, and sometimes they're born with impaired immune systems as well. So that might explain why she died younger than all of her siblings who lived to a ripe old age. Different forms of leukemia and cancer have been suggested. The most flashy but unlikely suggestion is that she was poisoned by the arsenic that was very common in Georgian medicine.
When they were living here, did they have staff to make their fires, to change them, to bring them hot water? Were they able to sort of maintain the the outline appearance of a genteel family?
They did have staff. Practically everybody did in Georgian England, unless they were servants themselves. Domestic labour was cheap and plentiful. So they did have a cook, they had a small household. At one point they got quite excited because they felt they were able to hire a footman. And this was something they were able to do once they were living in a rent-free environment. You see, that was one of the advantages of living here. But one of the things I like about Jane's lifestyle here is that her mother and her sister seem to have come to this agreement that they were going to not make her do much housework. So her job in the household, the thing that she had to do, was to make the toast at breakfast time. And she had to keep the wine cupboard locked up, which are important duties, obviously.
That's right. And so, did they disapprove of her writing? Did they? So they must have known. Even that story downstairs about the door creaking. The mother and the sister must have known she was a writer.
They must have known, not least because all of her life, the way that Jane used to develop her material, as I understand it, is that she used to read it aloud in the long winter evenings to members of the family. So if you're not terribly well off, you don't want to be lighting your room with loads of expensive beeswax candles. So maybe the family would light just one candle and one member would read aloud to the others. And we know that she did this. And I think that she would read out the funny bits and sort of see where people laughed and over time polish her work. Because she worked on her novels for a really long time. She did many, many drafts and they got better over time. But her mother's quite an interesting character because in Jane Austen's novels, there are a lot of bad mothers. And there were one or two little hints in the letters and so on that maybe they didn't have the easiest relationship.
Imagine, it must have been so difficult. But it must have been so difficult trying to maintain the appearance of gentility here, having no money and having these slightly challenging relationships between members of the family.
Yeah, and part of the reasons that her books were published anonymously is because of the whole gentility thing. But also, I think it's because she drew quite a negative picture of certain family relationships that maybe her own relatives would be challenged by, would feel threatened by. I mean, that brother living up the road with his big house, there's so many characters like that in the stories who are bad characters. You know, the ones who are rich and controlling and don't care about other people.
Let me ask again. So these two women, they're living in the same room. Although you're saying in their late 20s they're on the shelf, of course, we now regard them as in the prime of life. Did they have relationships? Did they know what it was to have sex or be in love with people?
Well, Cassandra has left us evidence that there was this great mysterious love of Jane Austen's life. He was a mysterious gentleman that she met on a seaside holiday. And in her novels and in her world, the seaside represents... Yeah, exactly. The sea represents love and freedom and passion and a lot of exciting sort of sexy things happening. Her most significant brush with marriage happened when she herself was 28 and she got a very good offer from a man with a proper mansion. So she said yes, she would have been set up for life, you know, future sorted. But the next morning, she broke it off. And that's because he was just too awful to go through with it. And that's before you take into account his very slightly amusing name, which was Mr. Harris Big Wither. So she said no to Mr. Harris Big Wither. And at that point, well, you know, the woman he did go on to marry ended up having 10 children. So I think perhaps part of her decision was, I don't want to have as many children as she saw her own sisters-in-law having. 2 of her sisters-in-law died giving birth to their 11th child. So she could see that future perhaps, or, you know, living with Cassandra in a cottage, not having a lot of money, but having a sort of level of creative freedom. I really wanted to show you these very nice little white satin dancing shoes, which didn't belong to Jane Austen. They belonged to one of her nieces, but she would have worn something like this when she was the belle of the ballrooms of Hampshire, as she was in her young days.
And so how old would you be when you were really hitting the ballrooms hard?
Well, you could, if you were really hot property, be married at 16, like some of the characters in Jane Austen's books. So when she was 16, she would have been introduced to the world as a debutante, and that meant going to balls, going to parties. And, you know, it's really a Victorian impression of Jane Austen, that she was a little old lady, a bit like Miss Marple, who wrote books sort of by accident, not really realising how good they were. That's an old-fashioned view of Jane Austen. What historians today see in her life is somebody who did have wild times, somebody who did have a lot of dancing partners, somebody who was notorious for flirting. In her letters, she complains about her hangovers on occasion. She got up to wild and naughty and passionate things as well.
In this debutante time of her life.
Yes.
So this is sort of 15, 16 to what sort of early?
Into her 20s, and then things perhaps sort of got a bit more serious when she was 25 and still unmarried. And that's when her father said, need to do something about this. I've got these 2 girls, I need to get them off my hands. And at that point, he moved the family away from Hampshire. They were living in a village just up the road. And he moved them to Bath, that was more of a happy hunting ground for husbands. But you don't get the impression that Jane really enjoyed her time on the marriage market in Bath.
When did she start writing, do we think? She was obviously corresponding and writing letters. When did she start writing novels?
Oh, from really early on. Growing up, she would entertain the whole family with these ridiculous short stories. They're called the Juvenilia now. And they're full of people going mad and fighting and having coach accidents and causing trouble. And by the time she was 21, we know that she'd completed the first draft of Pride and Prejudice, for example. So she was she was both a quick and a slow worker. She was at it early on, but she didn't get published until quite late on in her 30s. And this was partly because it took publishers ages to see what was good about these books, because there weren't any pirates in them. It was a sort of new genre of fiction, social satire.
As I'm listening to you, I feel sort of almost an anger bubbling up in the idea this astonishingly talented young woman who's just facing obstacles every single way, in every single direction that she turns.
I don't think her life was materially difficult. She always had a roof over her head. Someone always eventually came through and gave her enough money on which to live. But it was a psychologically difficult life because she was so put into this round hole when she was a completely clever square peg. And she was just, she changed the shape of the hole, really, to extend my analogy perhaps unfortunately far. But I think that through writing her books, she was changing expectations of how women like her were supposed to live their lives.
Yes, so we should talk about that. That was very interesting when you said outside, that actually even ignoring the artistic output on one level, you feel she's actually a very important human being in British and world history.
I do, yeah.
So why is that?
Because the key thing is, for me, this moment in her life, this night of her life, when she'd accepted this offer of marriage. And all of her life had led up to that point. Her parents would have been delighted, the family were delighted, everyone was expecting her to do that. But she had the courage to say no and to break it off with huge, social embarrassment. And I think the reason that she'd done that is because she just sold her first novel, Northanger Abbey, to a publisher. That had just happened. She just earned £10 for herself, which isn't a lot of money, but the significance was maybe she could become a professional writer. And because she did that, the Brontes were able to do it, Mrs. Gaskell was able to do it, George Eliot was able to do it. It became the thing. She was setting the pace.
And is that right? So were they inspired by her, or did she change the world of publishing so they were more open to manuscripts presented to them by females?
Well, a bit of both, really.
So she was an absolute trailblazer.
Yes, she was. One of the things that historians today are interested in about her life is her career as a professional writer. And as she went on, she became more professional about it and would go up to London and cut her own publishing deals and that sort of thing. And so there's the business of being an author, but there's also the subject matter of the books themselves, which is subversive.
Did she meet people like Mary Wollstonecraft or anyone else? Did any of the other amazing women of this period, or did she sort of exist slightly by herself down here?
Well, she didn't meet Mary Wollstonecraft, but she did have some other published writers in her extended circle of family and friends. And she was particularly keen on Fanny Burney. Now we should call her Frances Burney because that's more respectful. And when Frances Burney brought out her novel called Camilla, she did it by subscription, which is kind of like crowdfunding. So she says to all of her friends, will you give me some money, I'll publish a book. And in the list of the people who subscribe is Miss Jane Austen. And that's the first time that Jane Austen's name appeared in print. And I think she was only about 18. It looks like her dad paid for her to do this, to give the money to help another female author to bring out her book. So this was something that was clearly important to her.
So not looking for clues in any of her writing, any of her fiction, but actually looking for evidence in the real sources that we have about her life. What do you think she was like?
My favourite description of Jane Austen says that if you were in her presence, it was as if wit and jokes came oozing out of her. They just oozed out of her the whole time, as if she couldn't help it. And I think she was quite a sharp, quick, bitter, but very funny person. If she was relaxed with you, if she trusted you and opened up to you. Other people who didn't know her said that she was quite cold and silent and judgmental, a bit like a poker.
She was described as a poker.
She was a poker, sitting quietly in the corner watching everything that went on.
But her intimate circle was brutally witty and funny.
Yes, I think so. And one of the great ironies that's happened in recent years is that she's appeared on our banknotes. Have you got a picture of Jane Austen in your pocket? A lot of people will have a Jane Austen picture in their pocket because she's on the £10 note now. And this picture that was used on the note, was, you see, there's a wonderful irony here, which is that it was rustled up after she was dead because the publishers were finding that readers wanted to know what she looked like. So they rustled up this picture. She was dead. She had no say in it. It doesn't bear much relationship to reality. And someone who knew her looked at this picture and said, the author portrait said, that's a sweet and pleasing face. She really didn't look like that at all.
Oh no! So all this huge effort to get Jane Austen on the notes, it's not even her.
Oh, no, but there's a fantastic irony about that because it means that she's still playing tricks with us. She's being elusive. She's not showing us her real face, and that seems to me entirely appropriate.
How old was she when she died?
41.
So we could have dozens more novels.
She was just getting going when she was cut off in her prime.
And what happened to her family? What happened to her sister Cassandra?
Her sister Cassandra went on living in this little house and became a very old lady, and she ran a school for the girls in the village.
Wonderful. Lucy, thank you so much for bringing me to Jane Austen's house.
Well, thank you for coming, and there's something I'd like to let your viewers and listeners know about,
Which is
called Jane's Fund. It's on Just Giving. You search for Jane's Fund, you'll find it. And if you want to contribute to the repairs that they need to do to their roof, they'd be very glad to take a few quid off you.
Please go to Jane's Fund, everybody. And what about you? You've got a book out as well.
I have written about Jane Austen and her homes and her life within them, and that's called Jane Austen at Home, and it's just out in paperback.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.